distinguished speakers, and esteemed guests. If you see something, say something. Those were the words by which the Department of Defense started the Hack the Pentagon program 2 years ago. To date, the DoD has uncovered over 5,000 security vulnerabilities through their coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. This is now a practice recommended by several federal agencies, FTC, NTIA, FDA, DOJ, and more. We've learned that to make our vital systems unhackable, we must try to hack them. Today, there's not a single cybersecurity expert or opinion leader who would be against hacker-powered security. At the Senate hearing in February this year, every single senator who spoke up on this topic expressed their support for this specific crowdsourced model of cybersecurity. And we can take one step more and one step further and note that not having a vulnerability disclosure policy amounts to cybersecurity negligence. And today we are all here because we want to turn this best practice into not just a best practice, but a common practice for everybody, both in the private and the public sector. The asymmetry of digital threats will turn around to our benefit when we pool our defenses. The best cybersecurity happens in open collaboration. When we work together, we can solve all and any problems of cybersecurity. And there are tens of thousands, if not even hundreds of thousands of hackers out there, ethical hackers ready to help. And as a problem, a quarter of them reported to us that they were unable to report a valid security vulnerability because of lack of a vulnerability policy in place in that organization. But if we can work together, we hit harder against cybercrime. And together we can protect our fellow citizens. Tonight, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for the excellent work they do in driving public awareness of vulnerability disclosure and good cybersecurity practices in general, and for hosting this event with us. And I would like to thank the eminent speakers we have here from NTIA, DOJ, CERT, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, the Oath Corp, and the Oath Corporation for their willingness to contribute their valuable insights and opinions on this essential topic. So I would like to wish you all welcome to this event. Tonight, when we say something, I hope the world will see something. Thank you. And now I'll welcome Emily Remale to the stage, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It is great to see all of you here. First, let me start off by thanking the Atlantic Council, Mr. Mikos, and the upcoming esteemed panelists. You've really lucked out here today. These are the most thoughtful people I know on this topic, and each of these individuals has been a powerful force for change in this area. Their range underscores that this is indeed an ecosystem issue that requires active engagement from different parts of the government, civil society, and of course the commercial world. These are the real experts that can unpack this issue and talk about what has been done and the work that remains. But I do want to take a few minutes to reflect on how far we have come in just a few years. We should first acknowledge that real progress that has been made. Vulnerability disclosure used to be a very controversial issue. Now it is only slightly controversial. And in DC, if an issue becomes more boring, that's a sign of progress. Of course, CVD is not a new issue. In 2002, two security experts, Steve Christie Cooley and Chris Weisopal, proposed an IETF draft standard on vulnerability disclosure. In 2002, they noted that the issue had been a divisive topic for years. Compare the fights we've had about this to the world today. While things aren't perfect, and there probably will always be edge cases that don't have clear answers, thousands of vulnerabilities are reported and fixed each year. Hundreds of millions of users are protected thanks to the work that security researchers do. Yet there is still work to be done. The majority of American businesses, even the majority of American large businesses, do not yet have CVD policies or the organizational capacity to work with researchers. And of course, there is still plenty out there that insist on using the term responsible disclosure. But we have come far. Even just a few years ago, when NTIA was contemplating tackling this issue, we received many warnings that this was too much of a hot-button issue for what turned into our first multi-stakeholder effort. We had to explain that there were helpful hackers to our colleagues across the government. Not Leonard, of course. I don't want to spend too much time on NTIA's initiative, but the stakeholders that participated in that effort did such great work, and I think it has had a real impact. So I thought I could share a bit about it for those of you who may not be familiar. In 2015, we began our work on bringing stakeholders together to identify common ground and market-based solutions to address open cybersecurity challenges. We had a public request for comment, and a number of security experts, both in the private sector and the advocacy community, encouraged us to look at vulnerability disclosure. The preparation for that meeting was not without contention. Both the security research community and the vendor community were apprehensive. I suspect that each thought that we would be overly generous to the other side. In fact, we framed the initiative around collaboration between researchers and those who make and maintain the technology on which we all depend. It took a few occasionally tense meetings, but stakeholders were able to build on work that had begun in many different corners of the ecosystem and produce some results that we think still have value today. One group identified the key challenge of awareness and adoption of existing good practices. To understand concerns on both sides, they launched a survey to capture fears and obstacles. They received over 700 responses from both the security and research community, helping both sides understand the attitudes, feelings, and motivations of each other. For example, while only 15% of researchers expected financial compensation, 70% expected regular communication about the status of the security risk they identified. Another group focused on newer actors to the software and security space and drafted a guide and a template to get them started with an early-stage vulnerability disclosure policy. While this template, drafted from the perspective of researchers, vendors, and even lawyers, has been adopted by a large number of companies, it was particularly focused on safety-critical industries. And this work continues to still have an impact on protecting all of us. Finally, the third group tackled the thorny issue of multi-party disclosure when a vulnerability affects multiple vendors. This was a partnership with the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams and was very capable, led by CERT's Art Mannon. While they understood that there is no single solution for this increasingly important security risk, they provided an excellent guide for decision makers that continues to be used today. So what is next? Well, there is still a lot of work to be done, but also signs that give us optimism. For an example, the great work that Leonard has done with DOJ has had an enormous impact in boardrooms and hacking spaces. Leonard will talk about his work and the CFAA, but I wanted to touch on some of the work NTIA also does with another relevant law, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. The DMCA generally prohibits circumvention of technical measures that protect copyrighted works, including software. This prohibition can have unintended consequences, for example, if you're a researcher testing the security of some software. We often hear from researchers who are concerned that this law can have a chilling effect on such research. Fortunately, the law also allows the Librarian of Congress to grant exemptions to this prohibition and directs NTIA to consult with the Copyright Office and provide recommendations in a triennial process. 3 years ago, NTIA supported a broad security research exemption based on the extensive evidence submitted by researchers. While the Copyright Office didn't go quite as far as we recommended at the time, the result was a new security research exemption that we think has been a great start. This year, researchers and their partners in civil society have asked that the current exemption be expanded, including by removing limitations on what devices are eligible and on the circumstances in which circumvention can be carried out. NTIA is once again carefully reviewing the record and preparing detailed recommendations for the Copyright Office on this and other proposals. We want to ensure copyright interests are protected without hindering the kind of security research that is critical in today's digital economy and society. Beyond the law, there is plenty of work being done to promote CVD. Many of you worked with us to make vulnerability disclosure a part of the updated NIST cybersecurity framework, probably the most widely used cybersecurity guidance document in the world. This update added a subcategory on the vulnerability disclosure lifecycle. Finally, it is up to us to make this part of the global ecosystem. The internet, as NTIA often reminds people, is not just American. The digital economy is a global economy. NTIA contributed to a report by the European think tank Center for European Policy Studies on the state of vulnerability disclosure in Europe. This report found that there is nascent but growing interest and attention around this issue in Europe, and that more and more experts and governments are pushing for greater collaboration. Governments have a role to play, but so do private companies, policy advocates, and security researchers also, to help drive awareness and adoption. To sum up, NTIA is honored to have had the privilege to work with so many of you here and stakeholders across the ecosystem to help foster this collaboration. Our work was one small part of a broader movement that so many of you have embraced for so long, and there has been real progress. It has involved a huge change, not of new technical innovation, but of helping organizations evolve and helping minds to open and adopt. This isn't something that can be done by fiat, and it can't be done by any one actor. So we would like to thank the Atlantic Council and the speakers here, and everyone who has helped. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Happy to see so many folks here today, and I know that there's a lot more watching us online. We're going to kick off a panel. If you haven't already and you're in the room, grab one of these comics that we made up. It's the brainchild of Martin and myself over lunch about a year ago, and we finally see it as reality. The idea was we wanted to break down some of the common myths, misconceptions, and hurdles for people to understand why somebody would want to work with security researchers in a positive, proactive, collaborative manner. So check this out. There's also links to download it if you're online from the Twitter feed. We're joined by a very distinguished panel today. I'm excited for them all to kick in their perspectives. I think that this is one of the best and broadest panels that I've yet moderated on this stage. So I'm excited to learn from everybody and to allow you to learn from them as well. As kind of an opening, I will let everybody give a little, who you are, where you sit in the ecosystem and infrastructure. And I wanted them to answer, one quick question on, an example of coordinated vulnerability disclosure gone well. But given the nature of what we're releasing today, I thought it would also be good to give them an option of who is your comic or graphic novel character that you most identify with, and why? So Leonard, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Leonard Bailey from the Department of Justice Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section. I've been with the department now for 27 years. We are sort of the department's kind of experts on the use of computer authorities to conduct electronic surveillance, to prosecute any computer hacking, and to gather kind of electronic evidence generally internationally. So our place in the ecosystem is largely, as a lawyer, we don't actually do anything. We aren't technologists. We don't build the thing. We often support things. And one of the things that we've done just recently is we created a cybersecurity unit, the purpose of which is to take the expertise and experience that we have as prosecutors and plow it into preventing computer crime and other cyber crime. And with that in mind, we have taken some of the experiences we've had with things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and applied it to concerns that we've gotten from the computer security researcher community about the chilling effect of the CFAA. And lastly, in terms of a comic book character, so I'm going to actually surface my nerd credentials. I'm going to go with the Vision. A figure who was misunderstood when he was first came into existence. Not clear whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, but struggled with a very rigid set of morality driven by his synthetic brain. So that's my pick.
Good one.
Thank you.
All right, Bobby.
Wow, you set the bar really high there. Okay, hi, I'm Bobby Stumpley. I have the privilege of running the CERT, the organization you referenced with Art Mannion. I'd like to say, if I have to describe our role in the ecosystem, it has historically been we throw ourselves into the breach and try to figure it out. And I think that's basically been our role from our inception 30 years ago when the ARPANET was created and then something went wrong and they figured out somebody needed to step into the breach in that space. And in vulnerability disclosure, that's effectively where we've been for 30 years, is in the breach between industry, government, researchers, different parts of government, really trying to, in earnest, that was a word we used earlier, in earnest, think about the goals that make it a better, safer network, that make it a better, safer set of participants, and then what are the actions and motivations that help us get there as a part of it. So it's really been a phenomenal opportunity for me to be able to front Art Mannion and any number of other phenomenal experts in the organization. I've only been there for about 14 months and have spent a lot of time in the federal government prior to that thinking about coordinated vulnerability disclosure from the U.S. government's perspective as well. And so it's been a really interesting sort of historical context. And I have to say, I'm one of those girl geeks who wasn't really into comic books growing up. Maybe I would have liked to have been, I don't know, it wasn't really my thing at the time. Although I have a teenage son who has really introduced me in a really powerful way. So my favorite graphic novelist is actually Hayao Miyazaki. I said it wrong. Phenomenal guy. Disney just picked up all of his work about 6 or 8 years ago. So now he'll be really popular in the United States as well.
Cool. Jessica.
Okay, so my name is Jessica Wilkerson. I am a professional staff member with the Committee on Energy and Commerce, and I cover the cybersecurity portfolio. So what that means from an energy and commerce perspective is we essentially have a huge jurisdiction. If it's healthcare, if it's telecommunications, if it's commerce, if it's energy, I'm missing some that I'm sure I'm going to think of in a second, then it falls under energy and commerce's jurisdiction. And if it falls into that jurisdiction that involves cybersecurity, I'm probably working on it in some way. This has been really interesting when it comes to CVD and coordinated vulnerability disclosure, because there are very few issues I've found that just span as broad as energy and commerce's jurisdiction. But coordinated vulnerability disclosure is one of those. I mean, it shows up in healthcare, it shows up in energy, it shows up in commerce, it shows up in telecommunications. It's everywhere. And every company that we talk to now, this is one of the questions that I ask them when we do cybersecurity questions is, okay, all right, all of this is great, no hard-coded passwords, really happy to hear that. But do you have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program? And it's been interesting to see the different responses and how those responses have really changed. I think one of the biggest things for me, and it's actually become a running joke, I do a lot of healthcare cybersecurity now, and we have these 3 priorities that we always talk about. And the first one is coordinated disclosure, because we just view it as so foundational to everything else that you can do. If you can't accept free help, then you probably can't do much else. So that's really where we've been coming from, and I think it's been interesting. Leonard talked about DOJ. There's the DoD program with Hack the Pentagon. There are the two Homeland Security bills that just got reported out of subcommittee. So it's really been a sea change in the last couple of years, and I think we are still in the process of trying to figure out what exactly is the right way to thread the needle between the people who want to help and some of the ways that coordinated disclosure can go horribly wrong, which there are a few instances of that. But overall, I think we've really seen a lot of progress. I'm really excited to keep working on this issue and see where it goes. And that's where I'll wrap on the coordinated disclosure bit. Honestly, this thing on the comics, I really feel like I should have gotten 48 hours notice because I'm really not sure I can pick one in this amount of time. I'm a huge Marvel nerd. I made somebody go watch Infinity Wars with me at like 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. So I'm actually going to have to, I'll get back to everyone on the comic question.
All right.
Thanks. I'm Chris Nims. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Oath. And Oath is a subsidiary of Verizon. We are a dynamic house of a number of media and technology brands, of which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and use on a daily basis. We have brands including TechCrunch and HuffPost, AOL, Yahoo, Tumblr, and a number more. And we run, as part of the information security program that I have the privilege of running, I have a team which is known as the Paranoids. So being a house of brands, we have our own internal brand, the Paranoids. So my alternate title is Chief Paranoid. And it is truly a privilege to work with a group of security individuals who dedicate incredible amounts of their life towards protecting a platform and protecting a lot of users across all of our brands. We have roughly 1 billion users whose information is on our platform. So a great deal of pride in the work that we do every day to try and protect those users. And so as it relates to CVD, we run a very large bug bounty program. So Oath was created June of 2017 when Verizon acquired Yahoo and brought it together with a number of other brands, including AOL. And we took the public bug bounty program that Yahoo had established in late 2013, and we have adopted it for the entirety of Oath and all of our brands. So going back to roughly the April timeframe, we now have that program that is being leveraged across all of our brands, and we have incredible relationships that we've been able to build with the research community, and it's been really fantastic.
Not going to take a pass at.
So I put on the spot. I think the comic book character that seems to resonate with me is Daredevil. I think as we look at in the cybersecurity world, we would like to be able to see all the activity taking place on our platforms, and there are some limitations that kind of prevent us from doing that. So needing to have alternate senses, so to speak, to detect what's going on. I'm going with the vigilante.
Good answer. I feel like we're on Family Feud. Good answer, good answer. All right, so as we're starting to look more at cyber capabilities broadly across governments, across private sector, across military and other places, security vulnerabilities are no longer just an IT issue. They are now a national security, economic security, and more of a public policy discussion. That's why you see countries like the United States. There's, I think, 2 bills out there, one in the Senate, one in the House right now on coordinated vulnerability disclosure in kind of a whole-of-nation approach. The Dutch have a similar program. The UK is standing up something similar. So now that this is really in the national security spotlight, I'm curious to get some perspectives from each of your unique positions as to when that kind of happened, how it happened, why it's important, and what we'll see out of the future. Any combination of those questions. Whoever wants to jump on it first.
Well, I think I can probably go. Because I actually just spent a week in Europe talking to folks about cybersecurity concerns, and the reason that I bring that up is because we were there specifically to talk about WannaCry. And I don't know that I would say that WannaCry was the big turning point for coordinated vulnerability disclosure. There wasn't necessarily a CVD associated with that. But I think that has really been a watershed moment in a lot of people's minds about cybersecurity really can just wreck your day. I mean, in terms of critical infrastructure impacts, WannaCry and then NotPetya happening very quickly after that was just something that on the Hill, it gets talked about constantly. It's brought up constantly in a lot of letters that I've written. I've brought it up to say, you know, if you just want the one word context for why a cybersecurity issue is important, you can pretty much just say WannaCry. And I have tried to leverage that in my work to say, okay, WannaCry was one thing, but it was a lot of things. Let's look at what we can do before something like that actually happens. How do we start strengthening the systems? How do we move to a defensive mindset? That kind of thing. And this is why we return to coordinated disclosure a lot. Earlier this year, I'm losing track, we actually wrote 2 letters to CertCC and sort of said, you know, the Spectrum Meltdown disclosures happened and they were good in some ways and had some room for improvement in others, and let's continue this dialogue and figure out how this goes because, and I think we said it in the letters, like I said, they're blurring. Cybersecurity is so much a critical infrastructure impact now that anything that happens in the cybersecurity space could have a real impact on patient safety if you're talking about medical, or on the grid if you're talking about electricity and things like that. And so we need to start making the mindset transition from IT, like Bo was saying, to physical impacts. And I think for us, WannaCry has been that light switch, if you want to call it that.
You know, I'm actually going to suggest it started even earlier. So the federal government started a sort of serious cybersecurity move in around 2008. At the end of the Bush administration, there was a comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative that was started up and carried out through the Obama administration and taken up there. And I think there was a growing recognition that there was a sort of national security concern in the area that prompted that initiative to kind of spin up. But I think it's coming. Our sort of realization of the nature and scope of the problem has come in waves. So, you know, after that, you saw sort of it hitting the consumer population in a different way. 2014, 2015, you saw sort of the mega breaches. And that has continued. It's such that I think January of 2017, I think there's some stat out there saying 64% of the U.S. population has gotten a notification that they've had some sort of compromise of their information. The danger of this, though, is a certain numbing. After seeing headline after headline of the mega breach, until I think this last year, when you saw with things like election hacking, a realization of, in very concrete ways, how much this activity can compromise some of the basic foundational institutions of the country.
So one of the interesting things about all this, I feel like sometimes when you're in the security business, you feel like you're a hamster in a treadmill. You're saying the same thing over and over and over again. You feel like you're over communicating and you're not connecting. And certainly, I think for me, the last 8 to 12 years, there's been a different conversation than there was the 8 to 12 years prior to that, and a different audience being open to the discussion. And if I reflect back, I think it's both been a combination of people ready to hear it and those of us who've been saying it finding different metaphors to use, right? So both sides of this discussion have matured in a really interesting way. But the other thing I think as I reflect back and to sort of bring it back around to the idea of coordinated vulnerability disclosure and what it needs to be today and what it needs to be going forward is we simplify, because security can be so overwhelming, so complex, because the technological landscape is changing so quickly and the humans are really trying to absorb what that means to them. We simplify the things to do to something almost too clear. And by almost too clear, I mean you get the feeling that if you've done these three things, you're done. It's off my plate. Check. Everybody's got a coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. I'm done. And it's an evolving problem. So the national security metaphor is a good one. The public health metaphor is a good one. Any of these sort of evolving problems where we recognize that all of the variables are shifting at the same time. So one of the things that we say a fair amount is that coordinated vulnerability disclosure is a wicked problem. In the purest definition of wicked, you aren't really sure what success looks like. You aren't really sure what the levers you have to influence it. You aren't really sure how to motivate people to move the ball, and you aren't really sure that when you've done all of that, if you think you have a path, you'll actually get somewhere. Now that doesn't mean we should wash our hands of it and say no. There's been a ton of progress and more clarity near term that we have, but I think it's going to be important for us to recognize that 2 years from now, this isn't going to be a done thing. All right, 2 years from now, we're going to be talking about the next set of problems in this space and recognizing that scale has changed, pace has changed, participants have changed, and we might use the same words, but the environment is different.
Yeah, I think security is definitely a topic or something that will never be done.
Yeah.
You will never get to the end of the day and say, check, security done, go home.
Right.
Right. What I would say is, thinking about the benefits, and I have the most experience in this with the bug bounty program that we run, and looking at it from the perspective of what we'll say winning does look like, or what success looks like, as every day, things you want to get better and get better and better. Mm-hmm. But if you start to look at what success looks like, ultimately, and I think about this as how I talk about it with leadership, with employees, et cetera, it's ultimately about reducing risk.
Right.
Right. So I talk a lot about, to try and set the context, right, in a culture inside the company of security. I actually get up pretty much every single company all hands. I have a couple minutes where I get up and talk about security, or somebody on my team will get up and talk about security. And I use language, I talk about the fact that we are up against dedicated human adversaries. And by this, I truly mean there are individuals who get up in the morning, and whether they put on flip-flops and walk to Starbucks, or they put on their uniform and go to the military base, who do nothing all day but attack us. And they have very clear objectives, and they organize their work in campaigns, and those campaigns can be very, very long-term campaigns, and those objectives don't change over time necessarily. And so every single time a vulnerability is found in our platform by a researcher, and we fix it and we close it, that's a vulnerability that's not going to be exploited by one of these dedicated human adversaries. So as you scale that, right, you're significantly reducing your attack surface, and you're significantly reducing risk. And again, as you scale that, security gets better, risk goes down. And that starts to feel like success anyway.
But a bug bounty program is the end of a process, right? You don't start coordinated vulnerability disclosure in a company by establishing a bug bounty program.
Well, I think some companies perhaps take that approach, but there's definitely a maturity curve, if you will, right? So I have experience with both. Simply having a program where, when we started it, we just had a kind of a hall of fame. Mm-hmm. And if you submitted a vulnerability and we validated it and fixed it, we would put your name on the hall of fame. And for a number of researchers, that was actually great for them, right? Because so many of them are motivated not by the financial aspect of it. Certainly many researchers actually do this to pay the bills, so they care about that. But they really want to see the work that they're doing. They want it to be meaningful. And so they want to see action.
Yeah, you raise a good point about the motivation issue, and I want to come back to that and maybe ask a question around it. But before we get there, something that everybody has kind of touched on is the coordinated vulnerabilities that have gone well and the ones that have gone not so well, and the relative level of maturity and experience between researchers as well as organizations who are catching or being a part of a multi-organizational coordination effort. I want to see if maybe everybody can throw out one example of a good one and or a not so good one from whatever aspect, because I think it's important to both model what good looks like and what good outcomes can come out of these types of engagements with security researchers, as well as to show that we've got a lot of room to grow and to build, and what does that look like. So a good coordinated vulnerability disclosure experience and or a not so good one that you can point to, whether it's one your personal experience or one that's out there in the ecosystem.
So I'll start. I'm going to cheat a little bit by saying ultimately every single report that we receive from a researcher where we validated it and we fixed it, that's a huge win. Some of them you're dealing with human beings, right? And you're dealing with a very diverse set of people, diverse skills, diverse backgrounds, diverse personalities, and so there are interesting idiosyncrasies, right, in how any particular report, from the time it was reported to their interaction throughout to being fixed, can vary from time to time, but ultimately, from my point of view, we've seen just over and over and over again, win after win after win, because we're closing vulnerabilities. I would say, as far as things that have not, been ideal, is when you see somebody report a vulnerability to you by tweeting it, right, or reporting to somebody else by tweeting it to. So that ultimately, in my mind, doesn't necessarily facilitate collaboration, and but again, you've got different incentives, right, for the different folks involved in this.
Yeah.
But I prefer not to learn about things through just a random tweet.
Don't we all? I actually am going to steal my good one with credit to Jen Ellis. So Jen Ellis is from Rapid7. She's just amazing at everything she does, and she actually has been a huge reason why CVD on the Hill and in Congress has been an issue that has steadily gotten attention and steadily gotten much better. So major props to Jen. But she shared a story with not your traditional IT company, but a safety critical manufacturer had a vulnerability in their product, and somebody from Jen's team had found it. And they were kind of doing that awkward dance where no one really knew each other and nobody knew who they were supposed to be contacting, but they all got on the phone together. And then it just so happened to turn out that Jen and one of the people from the company that was affected by the vulnerability, had attended a meeting together recently. And they kind of recognized each other's voices. And that was the big reveal, where suddenly it was just like, okay, this is not a faceless human being. I can put I know who this person is. I spent a couple of hours talking to them. And so there was a level of trust that was established there immediately that she has shared really helped them go forward in a positive manner. And I think that's really key. And that's I won't point to a specific disclosure that went bad, but there are a lot of claims sometimes when we see public disclosures, if you want to call it that, non-coordinated disclosures, where the people who are attempting the disclosures, who end up going to Twitter, or they drop it on the full disclosure mailing list, whatever they do, this claim, I tried to talk to the company, but I couldn't find them. You're never going to be able to prove it one way or the other. Maybe they did try, maybe they didn't. But I think this maybe I'll call it a sea change. There really does seem to be a difference now in the ability of security researchers to reach out directly to security people at some of these companies. Even if you're just, I Googled it and it turns out this Twitter handle belongs to the security person at this company. Instead of tweeting it, you DM them. I mean, that kind of intimacy that people have been able to establish, I think, is helping to lower the amount of non-coordinated disclosures where you have these claims that, well, I couldn't get a hold of this company and so I just did it.
Yeah, I think that's sort of indicative of the characteristics of what makes something positive or negative. And for me, there are lots that have gone well, but every one of them is an opportunity for better. Right, I'm unfortunately the kind of person who is always looking at the horizon. It never actually arrives, and so there's always this opportunity to do better. And the characteristics of things that help us do better, and you heard some of them here, right? This presumption that the researcher is trying to help, that they're not an evil individual who's really not trying to improve things. That there's a common objective to reduce harm. To reduce risk. And if you start from that position, the dialogue, the trust becomes much easier to start with. I was really intrigued by something you said about feedback you'd gotten from researchers, that they're not so much in it for the money, but when you didn't call them, when they didn't get a phone call back, when there was no communication. This is a situation where over communicating for all parties, not just builds that trust, but is really, I think, continually important and helps with the really important thing, and that's to avoid surprise. We don't want to hear about it on Twitter because we're surprised. We don't want someone to get so frustrated that they need to resort to something like that. We want to avoid that sort of surprise. And thinking about, in every one of these disclosures, thinking about the things that we can do to incentivize the desired behaviors that we want. And those incentives don't have to be cash, right? They could be as simple as believing or dialogue or incorporating that individual in sort of your thinking as you go forward. And so to me, those are the characteristics of good coordinated vulnerability disclosure.
And I'd say, speaking more as an outsider, I'm not in the trenches like these folks who are running programs. But let me give an example of when I think went well, and I think really was a sea change moment, which was the Hack the Pentagon program. I think that changed the nature of the conversation generally, because it's hard to be a network owner and say, I have something that's more valuable than the Department of Defense, right? So the ability for them to stand up a program, to figure out how to do it, and we actually worked with DoD back in 2016 to think about some of these issues, and we ended up issuing a statement in support of it, along with former Deputy Secretary Ash Carter's announcement of the program. But that was a program I think that was very well thought of, and not just its implementation, but also in terms of sort of the public affairs impact of it. So that would be my example of something that went well. In terms of something that didn't go so well, I also have kind of an odd perspective on that, because at the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, we actually are consulted with by all of the 94 U.S. Attorney's offices across the country when they bring a computer fraud and abuse case. And every so often, not that often, but every so often, a case will come in that is about a company that is concerned that they are in fact being extorted by someone who has called them and said, you have a problem on your network and I can fix it for a price. One thing, and again, this doesn't happen that often, but it's happened often enough that we have encountered a few of these. Sometimes these are simply misunderstandings in terms of the way in which people are engaging, and we're hoping to, in some of our engagement and through things like the vulnerability disclosure framework that we produced and released last year, influence some of those conversations. We're hoping that along with companies thinking about the value of a vulnerability disclosure program, you also have researchers thinking about issues like, is my conduct more invasive than it needs to be in order to demonstrate that there's a vulnerability here, a proof of concept? Am I possibly harming third parties like customers who have their information on the network and I am somehow invading their privacy? But I think those things are coming along. But the examples that we have that probably suggest things that didn't go right probably are largely about both misunderstandings, one, and two, some kind of ham-fisted ways of thinking about vulnerability disclosure in the context of sort of a commercial effort by the security researcher.
But I think, so the comment about about that that's really interesting, and is that there's a really international component to this, right? When I think about misunderstandings in the U.S. government or in domestically, that's one thing. When I think about coordinated vulnerability disclosure that engages international forums, right? That's one of those places we live that we're really sensitive to, and so examples of things that involve multiple countries because the product or the capability might involve them is another place where we need to be really careful, right? I think crack is an example of something that went well and involved Japan and the Netherlands and a variety of places, in part because we built a bunch of relationships beforehand, but.
And that's crack, not the street drug.
Not the street drug.
Clear.
No,
the
Wi-Fi vulnerability,
yes.
yeah.
All right, well, we're getting ready to throw it open to questions to the room as well as to Twitter. So hashtag YCVD or just ping your hand up in the air when we get to it. But I want to throw out one more, hopefully fun thing for the group. And if you feel like you can't answer or don't have a good one, then feel free to pass or wait until the question round. But I want to, in talking with dozens of organizations about coordinated vulnerability disclosure, different types of organizations, it seems like there's always a set of things, hurdles or challenges intellectually or cognitively that individuals have to overcome in order to say, all right, we're ready to start talking to researchers and working with them. And so I wonder if you could all just go around and give one example of a truth that people will realize or a myth that you can bust that will help get people over that challenge and over that hurdle and to the moment of enlightenment a little bit quicker. Any readily come to mind?
I have one.
Jessica.
I'll try and capture this as succinctly as possible. But this is actually something that I have to explain to my members quite a bit. Your network is really not your network anymore. Everything is so interconnected with, a business with its suppliers, its customers, everything else, that this idea that, okay, this is my stuff, this is my network, this is what I have to protect, is really not the way that it is anymore. You have to worry about everybody that you're connected to. And so what we try and explain to folks, myth that we try and bust for folks when we try and talk about CVD is essentially saying the internet and modern information systems are too complex. You will never be able to understand them by yourself. And so ask for all of the help that you can get. Ask your suppliers, ask your customers, ask the random person who is just joking around on your website and found something. You will never succeed otherwise. It's just too complicated.
I would say another myth that a number of companies may have is that they can do it on their own, right? Even really large companies, very mature companies, have the response of, well, I have teams that do pen testing, or I hire this firm or that firm to do penetration tests, and so before I launch a product, I've done a pen test on it, and so it's secure, and that's good enough. And the reality is that's simply not true. And to your point about getting all the help you can, even if you do have a dedicated team. I have a dedicated team that's our red team, and their job is to be the adversary. And they come to work and sometimes flip-flops, generally not a uniform. But there's only a handful of them. And by working with the research community, I was talking about diversity earlier, you get a diversity of talent and thought that when you bring that together up against interesting technical problems in very complex networking environments and applications, you kind of bring those things together and honestly like magic starts to happen. So you can't go it alone.
What is a vulnerability is clear, obvious, and persistent. I would call that a myth, right? And I think that's one of the challenges that we have sort of in this space. Here is it isn't as though it's got a little bug sticker on it that you're just walking around looking for. I'm being a little flip, but I think that's a real challenge, and therefore knowing everything may not be possible, and that also means that even if you had let's assume such a thing existed. Even if you had pristine parts, you may not have a vulnerability-free compilation of them.
And I'm going to sound, kind of echo a number of things that people said. I do think there's been a maturity generally that's helped everyone, and that is, a few years ago, if there was, let's say, we'll start with an actual intrusion, heads would roll. A CISO would be fired because he or she must have done something wrong. I think there's a greater recognition of the complexity and the difficulty of putting together a system that is problem-free, and an understanding that, or there should be an understanding that typically does not exist. It is an industry standard that there are somewhere between 15 and 50 errors per 1,000 lines of code. And most of the commercial products we purchase are tens of millions of lines of code. And so there's sort of, I wouldn't say failure built in, but there are vulnerabilities built into the system. And so the need to conceal the fact that you've got a system with vulnerabilities, I think there may be less a sense of the necessity of that, or admitting that there is a vulnerability someplace.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to throw it open to the room for questions as well as to Twitter. Again, #YCBD. We've got a mic runner in here, I believe, who can come over. When you're announcing something or asking a question, just say who you are and who you're with. We'll go to Twitter for the first one, which is, can you talk about how some organizations are resistant to any form of public disclosure, even after issues are remediated, and how we can improve that? I guess implicit in that question is that a public disclosure of a vulnerability is inherently good. So maybe there's a couple of things that you can unpack if you want to talk about those.
Yeah, I wish that were right. I wish there were a path that we could lay out and say, do this, then this, then this, then this. But I think it's sort of back to the myth commentary, right? That recognition that vulnerabilities exist, that they're a part of the infrastructure, and that action needs to be taken. Getting everyone comfortable with that, I think, will increase the likelihood when public disclosure is the thing that's chosen, of that being a comfortable mechanism, I think. I'm sure I will get any number of text messages from the team as I say this here, because, but if you keep your eye focused on the reduce harm and reduce risk, that I think is if that's the driving force, then yes, sometimes public disclosure is really important. Other times it's a closed ecosystem and maybe it isn't important. I don't fall firmly on one side of that debate versus another.
Yeah, I'll editorialize from my pulpit, but in a lot of cases, if one organization has made a mistake, whether it's a software flaw that they've coded, whether it's a component that's not configured optimally for security, whether it's some other policy that they have, other people are making the same mistake. Yeah. So by revealing it publicly, you can inoculate the rest of the ecosystem for the folks who are paying attention. And we actually see it a lot in certain segments, certain parts of organizations, like the FDA has said they want people to share vulnerability information among themselves so that they don't make the same mistakes as everybody else. Well, any other thoughts?
I think I would add, I view it as a confidence building measure. If you have a company that is mature enough and confident enough in its own products and its own fix to admit that they had a vulnerability, and in fact, my favorite thing is even beyond when they say okay, we had a vulnerability and here's what it is. I love those blog posts that are like, all right, we're going to take you into the dirty details. Here's how this showed up. Here's the 7 days of pizza and energy drinks as we tried to solve it. Because to me, that just says, okay, this is a company that gets it. And to me, if I'm sitting as a consumer and as a policy person, that gives me much more faith in that company than in one that fights the disclosure, that fights doing it publicly.
Yep. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. We'll go with you first and then go towards the back. Again, just say your name and who you're with.
David Moran with the Council on Science Society Presidents. I'll address this to Mr. Bailey. The diversity of organizations that you all are talking about is incredible, but the one that I think that we all should focus on is the vulnerability of our voting system and the software, the multitude of software systems that we have in the electoral process across this country. So it's not just one company, it's 50 companies times 50 counties in each company. And I'd like, if you could, and perhaps you all could do this, maybe discuss the fact that single organizations may not be as important as some of the diverse ones.
So you put your thumb on what is a very difficult issue. With the election system that we've selected across the country is driven by states. And so you're right, you have 50 distinct companies with 50 distinct practices. And maybe not 50 different levels of preparedness, but multiple levels of preparedness. I think what you're seeing now is an attempt to level set everyone. You have multiple agencies working now in an attempt to try to get some sort of baseline effort. That's not to say that all states need it. Some states were very good at their security, but those that lag certainly need to be brought up to some sort of baseline. On the front lines right now, you're seeing DHS trying to do that with agencies. With states. But I think you also are seeing states taking a great deal of ownership over the effort as well. Figuring out how exactly to centralize all of this, I think, is something you're seeing happen now. But it is done against the backdrop of an understanding that election systems have been traditionally, by our practice, run by states. And this process of coming to a coordinated place where we all have common understandings of the levels of security and safety, I think that's a work in progress.
Can the Department of Justice be the coordinating function for all of these independent state agencies?
So I'm going to go with my bureaucratic cop-out, which is above my pay grade to assume such a role. But I do think that the federal government writ large understands the severity of the issue and is working to solve that.
Yeah, I'll say just a thought to bring it directly into coordinated vulnerability disclosure. We've seen a lot of individuals who are really passionate about fixing the voting system, the security of the voting system, try and find vulnerabilities and report them in good faith. We've seen a lot of the organizations and companies and secretaries of states and others who have varied responses. Researchers have varied ways of going about it. Organizations have varied ways of responding. I think we've seen a lot of high-profile, poor collaboration with low trust, and that's been really harmful. But there's also been some very quiet, good collaboration that's gone on that doesn't make headlines, and in a lot of cases, it's probably not great to go and trumpet those. But I think that over the next 5 or 10 years, that's going to be a major area where having security researchers and the different people who make up all the various different components of the election systems working together is going to be a really good way to go. And I think at the state level, we're starting to see more uptick in coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I can't remember which state it was. Delaware maybe launched a disclosure program, which is pretty cool. They're obviously a big one for corporations. Question over here.
Hi, I'm Nick Leiserson with Congressman Langevin, and I want to pull on a thread that you had mentioned, Bo, about motivations, partly because I think on the Hill, there's a lot of jumping to the bug bounty when, as Bobby pointed out, that can often be the end of a process, not to the beginning. And I think in my experience with talking to folks on the Hill, a lot of that is because there's this assumption that anyone who's going to be disclosing a vulnerability would be doing it for money, and not to. I was part of the NTIA multi-stakeholder process on the vulnerability disclosure report that said, 15%. There are definitely some people are definitely motivated by that, but not everyone. And I'd be curious, both from the panelists what they see as different motivations that help people come forward and disclose a vulnerability, and also how we can better communicate that to policymakers so that there isn't just the jumping to, right, if we give people money, we get it, that makes sense to us, but not necessarily understanding the utility of having a vulnerability disclosure program in place first.
Yeah, I'll say your boss had a great set of comments the other day on a markup, bill markup discussion, exactly two motivations. So it's clear that some people on the Hill are starting to get it, and starting to have more depth of character understanding about who security researchers are. But I'm curious, I think everybody's talked about motivations and incentives a little bit for the researchers. Maybe somebody wants to expand on that a little bit.
I think one of the things that's interesting is even in that 15% that say they're motivated by financial reward, that's not necessarily even their primary motivation. I spent some time earlier this year, we did a live hacking event, and we brought in 40-some researchers from around the world, and they spent 8 hours hacking against our products and brands for the day. And I spent a lot of time with each of those researchers asking about motivations, because I want to understand how to keep the best researchers on our program, right? Selfishly wanting our platforms to be stronger and more secure. And I was expecting to hear, pay the biggest bounties and things like that. And there were very few people, if any, that really kind of identified the bounty payout as being the thing. They were much more interested in ongoing dialogue, the ability to communicate with the security team or even the developers, kind of that ongoing interaction, and they're really motivated how quickly you respond to them, and how quickly you can resolve the vulnerability, because that really is meaningful when they see their work is given quick attention by whoever the organization is that's fixing it. Those are some of the things that are really meaningful to the researchers.
Yeah, I like I said, I've been doing a lot in healthcare cybersecurity recently, and Bo, you know this pretty much better than anyone. Most of the security researchers, I'd say, in the medical healthcare space actually are really just in it because they want to save lives. They really care about protecting people from cybersecurity vulnerabilities in healthcare products. And so I think it's been very helpful for me to be able to pull out a bunch of disclosures from security researchers in the healthcare space and be able to take them to the people that I work for and sort of say, like, look, yeah, at the bottom of the disclosure, this person has said, and thank you, X, for bringing this to our attention. But to Chris's point, it's just this idea of, let us help you. We want to help. We're here to help. And I think that's, at least in the healthcare space, is really shown through.
Yeah, I think the ability the researchers have to connect technical to impact is, I think, really profound in that motivation. Assume benevolence, and that stay focused on risk, reduce harm. I think some of those important design principles, and I think really characterize motivation. Now, how do we write that in a bill, right? How do we translate that to something that is sort of understandable, particularly if you live in a world of cynics? That's a more complicated human problem I wish I had a good answer for.
And this kind of goes to something we were talking about earlier. I was saying that we've got kind of a new definition for hacking, that you could consider it to be taking a device or information or process and repurposing it to do something that its creator didn't intend, which can be done legally or illegally. The one thing I think I've seen, at the risk of now becoming the subject of a variety of cyber attacks, is that with the hackers I've talked to and the community I've witnessed and observed, these are folks who often are smarter than many of us, but certainly want to demonstrate that. And I think that's part of the motivation, the opportunity to demonstrate that I can take something that was created, something even you created, and make it do something you never knew it could do. And it's really pretty cool. Yeah. And so that's, I think that there's a large part of the community that seems to be motivated by that.
Yeah, I think in the conversation earlier, somebody said, yeah, we just call that innovation when it's not called hacking. But there's a little bit about motivations in the back of the comic. So when you pick one of those up, flip to the back and read through that. It's the shorthand version is there's essentially 5 categories of motivations. Everybody's got a different one. But from a lot of our experience in working with the security research community, we tend to see people tend to major in one, minor in another. And that's protectors, people who just want to do the right thing. It's puzzlers, people who are really curious and maybe sometimes they want to show you that they're smarter. So pride and prestige is one, which can drive people to be really, really good and to push the state of the field. Profit is certainly one of them. There's some people who make their living doing bug bounties. Particularly that's the case internationally, as Bobby said, where maybe you can make $500 in a week and that's enough to send your kids to college. And then there's also some others who may be patriotic, so they want to find bugs in the Pentagon websites to protect the nation. So go check that out in the comic. Question over here.
So I'm Peter Chu from Galileo Consulting Group. So what I observe a lot is that the vulnerabilities, the weakest link is often the human, and you see that I just read an article about TIGTA busting a scam of IRS impersonation. Elections, another example. It's not so much that the election systems are getting hacked into, it's that the voters are getting hacked into, their minds are getting hacked into, right, by Russia or whoever. So do we consider that out of scope, this group, or is there some kind of lesson that we can learn from coordinated vulnerability disclosure that would apply to that?
I think there's a technical answer, which is anything that you put within scope for your vulnerability disclosure program is in scope. And if you want some more guidance, the NTIA document has a big section on what's maybe in scope, what's not, preferences versus what's technically in scope. But I think that the more that our lives are connected to the digital domain, the more influenceable they will be by people from the other side of the world. It's just an inevitability. It's often said that the internet doesn't respect national borders, which is true to some degree, not true to other degrees. I think that we're going to have to, over the next 100 years or so, learn how to deal with the new world that we live in and what's considered the norms of behavior, not just state to state, which I know a lot of people are working on right now, but human to human, right? So if I walk into a restaurant and I'm wearing Google Glass from a few years ago, some restaurant might throw me out and say our patrons don't want to be surveilled. Thank you very much. I think there's a whole big discussion you could have on some of those questions that's well beyond coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I think it's an exciting discussion because it's so unfinalized yet. It changes anytime we get something new. Anybody have other thoughts about?
The only thing I may toss out is I think it may be there resident in the way in which we talk about cybersecurity policy largely now, which is not in terms of prevention but risk management. And that's because there are certain risks you just can't wring out of the system. And one of those is humans. As an attack vector, we know that phishing is incredibly effective. And it's incredibly effective not because people are dupes. I think any skilled phisher can craft some lure that anyone's going to fall for. And so there's some inevitability that I think we're coming to when discussing the nature of this problem, and that I think it's partially because humans are fallible.
Well, humans are also innovative, right? So it's sort of a both side
pessimist,
kind of chat.
optimist.
My turn today. Tomorrow it'll be yours. But no, I think it's that idea of risk management and of resilience go together. You manage the risks away, the risks you can away. You accept the ones you can't. You're resilient through the event that you're handling, both as an individual, as a society, as an organization, as a part of it. So.
Go to the phones for one. Again, if you're following us on Twitter, #YCVD. Can a vulnerability disclosure policy be too open? Why or why not? I think the easy answer, and this may unlock some thoughts, is you can have vulnerability disclosure of all types and openness, right? On the one end, it's the full disclosure mailing list or sending it out in a tweet, and on the extreme other end, no one ever knows except the person who found it, right? And everything in between, encompassing private disclosure to the company or to somebody who buys it to use it for offensive purposes. You could have a more coordinated vulnerability disclosure where you disclose it to the company, and then once it's been fixed, you go public. And there's many, many different ways. But I wonder if there's one that's a tipping point, or if it's a one answer fits all scenarios kind of thing.
I think it's definitely not a one answer fits all. I think it simply can't be, right? Because the ramifications of disclosure of something for one company could be very different than the ramifications for disclosure of something for a different company or organization, not necessarily companies. So I think it's definitely not simplistic enough that you could say it's a one-size-fits-all type of solution.
And I think it's depending on what I'm not sure what open meant in this question, but one of the things our vulnerability disclosure framework, which if you're curious, you can find it if you do a web search for cybersecurity at DOJ. We have a web page that has a variety of products that we've put out. Is we also want to make sure that people standing up programs are being responsible as custodians of third-party information. Mm-hmm. So it is great to have those vulnerabilities discovered, but a company has to realize that they also are holding third-party information. People who may have some privacy concerns about their information being exposed, even in the course of a legitimate vulnerability, disclosure effort. So, that would be a potential of it being too open. If it's whatever you get, that's fine. Handle it whatever way you'd like, even if it belongs to one of our customers.
I think, and actually here I want to give credit to Katie Masuris, because you just made me think of a line that she always has, which is a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program is not a substitute for just a risk management cybersecurity program in your organization. And so maybe tangentially off the question, what I would say to Katie's very well taken point is you can't just have a CVD program with the intent of it replacing a security team. So in that sense, that would be too open, I would say.
And as a part of that security team, a vulnerability management apparatus.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the thing that has to exist as a part of it.
Yeah. All right, we got time for about 2 more questions. So we'll go to the back of the room and then maybe the front of the room. Yeah.
This question, my name is George Folsom with Political Risk Management. My question may be a little bit beyond the scope of the panel, but it is certainly to Leonard and maybe to Chris, certainly. And that is, how do publicly listed companies in the United States handle CVD with regard to their need to make disclosures pursuant to the SEC rules?
Well, I think, from our point of view, certainly we're going to follow any and all disclosures required by any regulation that we deal with. And so as we deal with any security situation, consider it an incident, whether it's a vulnerability or something that you've stumbled into that is anomalous activity, we're always going to be looking through the lens of, is there some kind of notification or disclosure requirement, and that's absolutely going to be in mind regardless of the security scenario that you're walking through. So vulnerability is just one case of thousands of things that could be taking place, and you're always going to be looking through that lens.
And this is a little bit outside of my lane because of the SEC rules around this and materiality and things of that sort. I mean, the one thing I would say, I can't tell you whether a vulnerability standing alone would be kind of a material event that needed to be reported. I can tell you that an intrusion that results from a vulnerability is more likely to be. Yeah. And so, that kind of informs how you want to approach this. That is, if you can learn about a vulnerability that will stop an intrusion, that kind of seems to tilt in favor of, regardless of the question of whether a vulnerability by itself would be a material event, the prevention of it is something you want to probably embrace.
Yeah. And one last question.
Good afternoon, Forrest Hare with SAIC. So my question is, I guess to be for everybody, is how do we feel that we're doing on the automation of the vulnerability data, or the technical data sharing processes? And I would say it's probably several processes. We have the NVD, we have some standards that are being developed, but I think we'd all appreciate that if a tree falls in the forest, really the best way to get everybody to not only hear about it, but to do something about it is for it to be, that process to be automated. So just curious how we think we're doing there.
It's funny you say that. We just released a letter detailing an investigation that we've been working on since March of 2017 into the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program, essentially saying this program is so critical for modern cybersecurity. There are some issues. We hope they get addressed. And we had some recommendations for it. But I think you're right. I think this is a conversation that I've had with Bo, with Josh, with many other cybersecurity experts, with Art several times. That CVE, CVSS, the National Vulnerability Database, all of this is at some points taken for granted, but we, I think, actually said this directly in the letter or something to this effect. Without CVE, CVSS, NVD, and without the speed which makes that effective, you do not have modern cybersecurity. You can't. It's the language that everybody speaks. It's how everybody knows to talk about vulnerabilities. It's how we know how to compare them. So to the extent that automation can speed up that process, can make it more accurate, can make it more standardized so everybody knows, okay, when you say X, I know what you mean rather than thinking that you mean Y, then yes, very much so. I think that is a really key component of this.
Yeah, I'll say automation is great. It can speed up kind of dissemination of information. By and large, I would say most companies in the world can't take that automation. They can't make use of it the way that the top companies can, right? So for the very top companies, that speed of knowledge, speed of notification is the critical thing that they need. And tools like coordinated vulnerability disclosure can certainly play a part in that to get more information to more people faster. And then once something becomes known, it's part of a CVE, it has a CVE number, researchers can start looking for it on platforms and then start reporting it to organizations so they can fix it faster, right? I'll also say that one of the most important parts of coordinated vulnerability disclosure and about getting things fixed really is not the automation, it's not knowledge of the vulnerability, it's the trust and trustworthiness of those organizations and the researchers and others so that you can have those conversations to start talking about how you discover, how you fix those things, to get the information through, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities that will never have, that'll never get into some of those automated feeds. And then for the other organizations that can't take advantage of the automated feeds, to be able to raise the level of capability there to where they can. I think that's where there's a dramatic need to get people up to speed, which coordinated vulnerability disclosure can help with, but again, it doesn't replace an internal program. It can just kind of provide an external stimulus to make you get faster and better at doing those things. So, any other thoughts?
I think that for me, there are different phases of this whole process that are automated to different levels. We've got a lot of automation around flaw identification that may identify vulnerabilities. Right, so we've got a fair amount of software evaluation and pen testing and other mechanisms. There's automation in that space. There's automation in the patch dissemination phase. So we've got two ends worked out. It's all the messy stuff in the middle that there are not good, not necessarily good automated solutions for, in part because you can't automate something that isn't clear. So back to that myth, what is a vulnerability is clear. If we want to automate the whole process, we've got to also work through some of these really complicated kind of activities. I do think the asymmetry in automation there is a risk, and we really need to think about what that's going to mean.
Yeah. All right, well with that, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for tuning in online. Check out the comic book, download it, and let's continue the conversation, #YCVD. Thank you very much to my panelists, the Atlantic Council, HackerOne, Martin, to Evelyn and NTIA, and everybody. Thank you, and get home safely.